Well, think about the last time that you updated your CV. Did you spend like any time on page 2?
I've never had a page 2. I haven't done that stuff.
Good for you.
Nice. To the extent we have data on it, people spend between 6 to 10 seconds evaluating someone's CV or resume before they decide if they want to bring them to interview.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is Brave New Work, a podcast about reinventing our organizations and the search for a more adaptive and human way of working. I'm Aaron Dignan, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rodney Evans.
What's up, everybody?
On today's episode, we're going to talk about the Ready's hiring process, a recently launched experiment in how we consider and select new members. But before we unpack that, can I hire you, Rodney, to facilitate a check-in round?
I think you should interview me first. We will do a check-in question related to the topic, which is, what was the worst hiring decision you have ever been involved in?
So I don't know that one case comes to mind, but what I have been susceptible to over the years is that I'm a sucker for a good accent.
Cambridge, of all England, the Shire for men who understand.
And so I will listen to people talking and think, this person sounds super smart. And then later on, it might be true, it's panned out great. And other times I'm like, oh yeah, I just really like listening to them talk. So lesson learned.
That's awesome.
What about you?
Similarly thematic, but the one that popped to mind was a couple of companies ago when I interviewed a candidate and I just had bad feels. It was intuitively and energetically, we just did not resonate. And a colleague who I really respected a lot just convinced me that we needed someone and she would do, and she checked certain boxes. And so we asked her to join us, and it was as bad as I could have imagined it would be. And I feel like that's like the common theme is in most cases, people don't behave a whole lot better than they behave on a first interview. And so my worst experiences are where I ignored my spidey sense altogether.
Any hiring process that starts with, we need a warm body, is already off to a bad start.
We're already convincing ourselves to make a bad decision.
Yeah. So with that in mind, today's topic is hiring at the ready, our new take on this. And I guess I want to start by asking you, why did the Ready change its hiring process, and what were we designing for?
So I started working on this initiative about 6 months ago, and it's only now becoming something that lives in the world. I think we were just at a point of scale and of complexity in terms of geography and, frankly, our ambitions to grow, that it felt like we needed something that could really grow with us, which means looking at a more formalized process, having designated and governed roles around the hiring process, and having some technology to enable candidate and tracking and applicant management and things like that.
Right.
So that's why we did it. What we're designing for, that I've really had to continually coach myself around, is being people positive, designing for inclusion, designing for variety, and not letting ourselves fall into the common mindset trap around hiring of filtering out. And instead feeling like the move is to attract in. And it seems like a small flip, but it impacts actually every design choice along the way.
Right. It's almost like an inversion of the common idea that like we just got to keep the bad apples out. And now it's like, how do we attract all different kinds of people and expand and kind of, increase the complexity inside the system?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you and I haven't really talked about this since we started working on it in too much depth. I am curious to hear, like, in your wildest imaginings, what's the best case scenario in terms of the Ready's way of hiring?
Well, why I was excited about it is in some ways most, if not all, hiring processes are broken. And I think, the data suggests that we're not that great at eliminating our own bias. We're not that great at getting a mix of candidates in the door. We're not that great at just even being conscientious and disciplined about like getting back to people and making sure that everybody, is getting a high candor response to what happened and how the role unfolded. The internet is just littered with stories of bad hiring experiences, and very, very rarely do you read one where someone was like, it was great, I didn't get the job, but I love the process.
Right.
Like that does not happen. So I think one of my ambitions here was, could we have a process that kind of honored everyone involved and that we could actually be proud of, and also a process that acknowledges the fact that, like, yes, we want to filter, and yes, we want to get people in the door that have the right skills, but also we know that most people just aren't that good at hiring, and myself included. And so the math is never going to be perfect. It's never going to be like 95-5 in terms of, what works out. So can we have a system where it does a better job of getting people to, single themselves out of the process if they can see things during it that tell them a story about who we are and what it takes to be successful here, and who's going to be additive to our culture and our system. And then also a process that does a good job of, like, getting people in the door and then quickly figuring out in both directions, is this the right thing for everyone involved? So, a really low bar.
Oh, shit.
That's
not what we're doing.
Maybe just to make it really concrete for people listening, why don't you explain, since I didn't work on this, why don't you explain what it is that we're trying? Like, what is the process in a nutshell, and what are kind of its quirks?
Yeah, great. I'd love to hear your feedback on what we're trying. So there are really two parts of the candidate process. There's the applicant part and the interview part. We are partnering with a technology called Applied. You guys can check them out online and hear more. But the thing that's cool about Applied is that the first design principle around the technology is about reducing bias. And you can design a hiring process like you can design any process based on principles. And we decided, for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to talk about, that reducing bias in our process was a good first principle to design for. The way operationally that happens is through, in the applicant process, blind review. And so what that looks like is the applicant reviewers are seeing not whole applications, but one question from several applicants next to each other against a scoring rubric that we've created around specific skills. And they're scoring those things blind. And then we're seeing combined average scores.
So when you say blind, what do you mean?
I mean, if you're an applicant reviewer, you get a link in your inbox that you click into, and you just see a series of the same question with different answers to score. You don't know who the applicant is. You don't know what else they put on their application. You have no identifiers.
No name, no photo, no LinkedIn, no gender, no race, no background, nothing.
No resumes, no cover letters, nada. You only
just an
have
answer.
Answers.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the application piece. And then what we're figuring out right now is, what is the right bar to set in terms of inviting people into interview? The reason that's tricky in our space is because, and it's interesting because doing this work has actually taught me a lot about our category, because I've had to think critically about it. The challenge in our space is that because what we do is disruptive and it disrupts traditional power structures, a lot of the people who have been able to do this work first were white men, because they were the people most likely to be invited into the system of white men to disrupt the white men.
Right, because it's comfortable and the power dynamics are similar and all that.
Or it's more comfortable. It's at least, it's somewhat palatable. So then when you start to evaluate based on real demonstrated skills and experience, you're introducing bias into the process. And so even at this first speed bump, we've had to be like, okay, well, is it the questions? Is it the scoring? Is it like, how are we making sure that we're not reinforcing systemic bias in this small process? And so some of that is re-looking at scoring rubric, re-looking at questions. And some of it is looking at what is the bar that we're setting, and maybe including some people who have lower scores on some of the experiential things, but higher scores on things like self-awareness or things like facilitation based on their application answers.
given our social operating system, I do feel like trying to eliminate bias is like cutting heads off the Hydra. Where it's just like, you're just like, oh, great. Now anyone can apply and we don't have to, we're not seeing their name. And then it's like, great. Now the words that you're looking at, the words people choose are going to resonate because you're programmed to respond to a certain kind of language and a certain kind of confidence and yada, 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 yada. So it's like, yeah, how long is a piece of string?
That's exactly right. And I've really encouraged us internally at The Ready to never say anywhere publicly that we're eliminating bias, because we're not. Like 100%, we are not. We're
wrestling
just
with it,
designing to reduce it to whatever extent we possibly can.
Right. And so both on that front and then just on the general kind of functional, interesting, modern hiring system front, how is it going so far?
Yeah, so we're just getting to the interview portion. So that's probably for another episode, but the interviews look much more like actually working, like what it feels like to be in a duo. Because what we don't do with clients is sit around and interview each other. We don't like ask questions and answer them. It's not really part of our jobs. So so we're trying to simulate real work in the questions we're asking in the application and in the interviews. It's really freaking hard. I mean, I don't want to say it's going well because it feels really messy and it feels really hard. And I feel like one of our clients. Like, I know what the principles are that are important. I know what the outcomes are that I'm hoping for, but all of the new ways of upending traditional hiring processes are foreign to me. And I'm not sure yet which levers to pull and what's going to deliver. And so it just feels like I'm in the middle of the mess right now.
Yeah. But I mean, it's a good mess to be in. And I think one of the things that I always get excited about is when we're at the edge of something, whether it be how we pay ourselves or how we, give feedback or how we, in this case, hire. Like, I'd rather be out over our skis at the edge of the known universe than be sitting in a system that we know is broken.
Right.
So, yeah, thank you.
Right. It's interesting to use ourselves as a lab. And this is one place that we haven't done it to quite the same extent. So I guess, we talked a little bit about the fact that we know hiring systems generally don't work. Like, listening to what we are designing for and what we're trying, how does that land with you compared to what you see out in the world?
Well, I mean, I think there are two different tiers of what I see out in the world. So there's the traditional hiring approach, which is badly and deeply broken, which I would sort of describe as somebody writes a job description, HR shits all over it. They edit it until it's very generic or very dogmatic and bureaucratic in its language, and then they post it online and they post it on every job board. People reply with a cover letter and their resume and their LinkedIn link. And then people who are not the hiring manager or the team that will work with them review those applications independent of any conversation with the people that will actually work with them.
Sure.
And they rate them on whatever the, corporate dogma is and let through the ones that they think are tolerable. And then there are a series of interviews that are squeezed in to days that are filled with 10 hours of meetings. And after a few of those, if somebody is kind of personable and checks all the boxes with their experience, with their expertise and their credentials, then often they get an offer and sometimes they don't. And I think that almost everyone involved dislikes that process.
Right.
It's like nobody's super psyched. And I've worked with people that are inside these systems trying to get their team built and trying to grow or double a team in size. And they're just like, if I could just sit with the recruiter, if I could just sit with the person that's going through these applications, like we could find the people that are falling through the cracks, or we could change what hits the top of the funnel. So I think that's one side of it. And I think that this is worlds away from that.
What I think is funny, though, about what you just said is like, I actually don't think those people could do that. Like, I think inherently that's the problem, is like, to me, this is an interesting, complicated, complex conversation because people believe that if they could be involved, they could make a better process or they could be a better filter or whatever. And like, probs the answer to that is no. Because like everybody thinks they're great at hiring, just like everybody thinks they're great at having meetings, and everybody thinks they're a great leader, and everybody thinks they're a great facilitator. And the truth is like,
Right.
not that many people actually are, but there are a lot of people who are hesitant to default to a disciplined practice
Yes.
in complexity.
What I will push back on is I do think there's a quality difference. Like, I think there are different thresholds of quality. And I think there's a quality difference between someone that has no idea what the person is supposed to be able to do,
For
making
sure.
a hiring decision, and someone who's like technically and creatively aware of what they're going to do, trying to make a hiring decision.
For sure.
Neither one is perfect, but I do think the person close to the action has information that the recruiter doesn't.
Absolutely.
So there's value in getting close to the action. But to your point, even when you're there, there's loads of bias and BS that gets in the way to actually being a great, like, knock it out of the park hirer.
Yeah.
And so, and we're all so aware of this. And even in my own experience as someone that has hired, I don't know, 100, 150 people in my career, something like that, a ton of it goes on gut.
Right.
And it's just like, okay, number one, in the first 3 minutes of talking to someone, I already know what I think at like a, lower brainstem level. Like, how is it feeling? How is it vibing? How much are they resonating with the things that I think I want to hear? And a lot of that, I think, is just about self-similarity and about like feeling comfortable. And that's where all this bias creeps in, right?
Right,
Because it's
exactly.
like, this person talks like me and thinks like me and looks like me.
we
I
are
feel
vibing.
so comfortable,
Yeah.
and like, that's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, that's
so,
right.
So I think this whole like blink idea of approach to hiring has its merits, but it hits a wall of capacity building and difference, building that like you very quickly realize what that is. And I've lived that. I've been to the point where it's like, okay, I can do this reliably well 60% of the time. And if I keep doing it this way, I'll never get those extra 40 points.
Right.
And so the shift for me has been like, how do I override that stuff? And obviously what you're doing with tools and process is one way to override some of it. But even in the interview or in the interaction is where I've had to rewire my brain a lot to be like, if a person makes me uncomfortable, but they're sort of, checking the boxes on these other dimensions that make them able, then I really have to slow down and check in with that and be like, maybe I should do the opposite of what my instincts tell me to do, because that's going to expand my horizons and it's going to expand the amount of different thinking that's around me.
Well, and what you're highlighting is one of the reasons that we're trying to make each interview feel like a real work experience. Because if you play out the line of reasoning that you just laid out, like, for example, when I first moved to Durham, I got contacted for a very big job at a big technology company. It was like to head M&A there. And I had a lot of interviews, and each of the interviewers, I would go and read their LinkedIn profile, and they were like these humongous executives. And I would think like, oh shit, I got to prep and really know what my plan is going to be for growing this company and blah, blah, blah. I shit you not. I probably had 6 different conversations, and every one of them was like, walk me through your resume. Why do you want this job? Do you have questions for me? And if that's all of the data that you're getting, then all you really have to go on is like, are we vibing? And do you seem like someone I could work with? Whereas what we're trying to design for is like, even if you're not vibing with someone, if you're doing an exercise and you're in the work with them, you can really see their chops and you have a different data set to go on. Because you might be like, I don't want to have coffee with you later, but I loved the way you facilitated me. And like that was dope, even though we're never going to hang out. And like, that's cool because we're not hiring friends. We're hiring people who are like the best in the world at what we do.
And it's the only way to find out if the chemistry is there. So I had a former colleague that used to talk about this term generative difference. And the idea was there's lots of ways we can be different. But some of those ways are going to actually like increase our ability to sense make in complexity and increase our creativity and increase the quality of our decision making. And so it is cool, I think, to get into a room with someone where you're not quite sure about how it's going to go and see what the chemistry is. Like, what is does the idea come out the other way better? Do you arrive at places you didn't expect to arrive? Or is it, ho-hum, or does it go completely off the rails? There's so much there is so much complexity to this that it is like any relationship where you just don't know when like opposites are going to attract and when, sparks will fly. And to try to predict that through questions like, tell me about a time when you overcame an obstacle, Rodney. Like that is not going to get you there. You know what I mean?
No, it's not. And we're trying really hard to be complexity conscious as we build this process. So if you think about the interview process you described, which is a traditional interview process, there's nothing about it that is complexity conscious, which we know. What we're doing now that makes it super difficult, but also hopefully, fingers crossed, ultimately effective, is we're looking at the outcomes being produced by the work we're doing, and then we're looking at all of the different stages of the process and questioning which levers to pull. So it's like if the highest scoring applicants are not diverse, maybe the scoring rubric is wrong. Maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe we're posting in the wrong places. Maybe the top of the funnel isn't wide enough. If the people who are making it through interviews don't turn out to be the kind of practitioners that we like, maybe the interview experiences are wrong, or maybe our interviewers aren't trained properly. Like we're trying to be like, there are 100 levels here.
Yeah.
Let's be in a feedback loop on any of them, and let's let everything be open to being steered by results and by the data that it's producing versus, hiring processes that I have personally designed and run where it's like, here's the job description. We're never going to look at that shit again for 5 years. Like this is the job description for the consultant that we use here. Enjoy. We're just like, we get a piece done and then we run with it in perpetuity and hope that we get smarter instead of we're going to do all of these little things and through our experience make the system smarter.
Yes. And I have to say, with my like growth ambitious hat on, what I love about this process is that it only gets smarter if we put a lot of people through it.
Yeah, that's right.
And so like we need to grow the top of the funnel and we need to move more people through the ready system in order to make it better.
Yeah,
it's
that's
not,
exactly
an
right.
N of one is not going to do it. So,
right.
So yeah, and that is true of any learning system, right? Like that's why these, social platforms that have 1 billion people on them learn so fast, is that they just get way more at bats in a given day than anybody else. And I'm sort of, I aspire to see us get, that not that level of learning, but a level of learning that can really shape this thing in the right direction.
And that's been a great constraint because a lot of interview processes in companies like ours, where there's different ways of working, get taken up by explaining. So the most valuable connected time ends up being people who are like, the fuck is self-set pay? And like, what is governance? And we have to spend all of this time as experts in our own OS teaching candidates about our OS so they can decide if they want to be part of it.
Right.
And so with the ambition, growth, scaling hat on, Sharon and I have been super conscious of like, okay, we're going to make our working agreements available as part of the application process. And anyone who applies to the Ready needs to read parts of our governance record and consent to playing in those ways before they continue. And like, I realized that like in explaining the interview process, I was becoming a bottleneck. So I'm just making a video of all of the things that candidates need to know. So it's like, we're trying to figure out how to make the hiring process really feel like a self-managed process from the very beginning. And we know that that helps any system scale. So it's like, hopefully that's going to work for us, just like other new ways of working and more adaptive processes inside of an OS help our clients scale.
Yeah. I love that. That makes a lot of sense. And it gets
I
back
knew you
to this
would.
whole idea.
I had no doubt you'd love that.
It gets back to this idea of self-selection, right? Like the best system won't be one where we filter out a bunch of people. It'll be one where they filter out themselves because they've identified these ways that it will or won't serve them.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, so I think that's exactly right. So basically what we've done is we've eliminated, all the data, the resumes, the cover letters, the shenanigans. We've replaced it with just answer some questions about how you think about the work and then come in and spend some time actually doing the work with us. And then if we think it's worth, taking a risk together, then you take a risk on us and we take a risk on you. And we see how it works and we steer together. And if it's working 5 months later, then we keep doing it. If it's working 5 months after that, we keep doing it. And that's the concert that we're producing.
Exactly. We're making a market.
I love it.
So I've obviously been swimming in this pool for a while, and I thought a great guest to chat in more depth about the topic would be the CEO and co-founder of the technology partner that we're working with. Her name is Kate Glazebrook. And so when we're back after the break, we will be joined by Kate.
Ready, set, go. Hey, everybody. We're back with Kate Glazebrook, founder at Applied. Kate, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a thrill to be here.
So tell us a little bit about Applied and why you started it. Like, what was the journey? What was the reason?
So, our mission is actually dead simple. We just want to help the best person get the job regardless of their background, which in some respects reflects what I think everybody who works in talent acquisition believes their job to be. But we came at it from the perspective of that's just not happening right now, and you only need to open the newspaper or basically any academic journal to know that's not the case. And so we decided we needed to think about ways of taking behavioral science to attack that problem. And that's really how it all started about 5.5 years ago, when we started looking into the research around how we make decisions about other people and tried to think about ways of redesigning those processes.
Nice. And what have been some of the most significant truths that you have uncovered as you've applied different thinking and theory and science to this whole process?
I reckon two things hold true. One is, like in behavioral science, we talk about like this implementation action gap, the gap between me saying I want to be healthier this year and I want to go to the gym and all that sort of jazz, and the
I'm
reality
familiar
of
with that gap.
Yeah, most of us
gap.
are, particularly in the early part of the year, right? Like, the rate at which people sign up to new gyms is like through the roof in January, when everyone starts the year thinking they're going to be the best version of themselves. And of course, we all know we don't live up to those intentions. And I guess one of the kind of universal truths is that sort of stuff holds true for organizations as well. We all have these visions and statements about what we want to live up to. And then, of course, as you know through your work, that doesn't always hold true in people's experience of day-to-day work. And so it's trying to close that gap using technology and the opportunity to do that, to just sort of make it easy to do the thing that we all want to be doing most of the time anyway. In our context, that's like make it easy to make a more objective decision. And what we do is we try and structure what information you see and what information you don't see, so that it's just made as easy as possible not to get distracted by random factors about a candidate and instead focus on what they can do. I think the second thing that we've really learned over the last 5 years is when we first built the platform, obviously we were really passionate about removing bias from hiring processes. And we spent a year and a half experimenting, doing randomized control trials, testing all sorts of different ways of presenting information to people to try and remove bias. And while we were in that process, we were like, well, actually, while we're here, we should make sure people are like actually paying attention to information which is predictive of job performance. So then we went down another little research rabbit warren and looked at things like, well, of the litany of things that we test candidates on in hiring practices, which of them are actually predictive of job performance? And we came across, this resume CV thing that's been around for hundreds of years.
Utter bullshit.
We were like, yeah, exactly. Well, it is utter bullshit. That's exactly right. But it's also so pervasive. So it's been around for hundreds of years. We all have one. I'm sure you and I, in our jobs, have probably all applied to jobs with CVs. And we realize that the data behind it is so shit. Like the predictive validity of a CV to job performance is sort of less than 0.1.
Negative correlation, right?
Well, we could be a negative in some cases. Yeah, basically it's saying like 90% of the variation in job performance are explained by things that are not found on a CV, basically. And yet it is the foundation of most hiring practices. And at the very least, it's the first stage. So people get weeded out first on the basis of CV. And so I guess we sort of went out there saying, well, we should try and put into the hands of people, make it easy for people to use non-CV-based methods, which we know are more predictive and also less biased. So we had this like dual method of like wanting to make hiring processes fair and easy and smart, really, like three things. And I could never have predicted 5 years ago that the hardest thing about doing what we do is trying to take CVs off people. I thought it was going to be these conversations about bias, but it's the CV that's pervasive.
So I'm curious, given that they are so pervasive and that we know they're fundamentally not predictive, what are some of the, mistakes that people make, and where are some of the places that bias creeps in, just starting right from the beginning of the process?
Sure. So are you the sort of person that think about the last time that you updated your CV? Did you spend any time on page 2 when you were updating your CV?
No, I've never had a page 2. I haven't done that stuff.
Good for you.
Nice. So I'm a former bureaucrat. So I was the sort of person that I was sub bullet point 2.1, how do I describe that second job I had 7 years ago and all that sort of jazz. And the reality is that from a behavioral standpoint, we know nobody is paying attention to sub bullet point 2.1. In fact, to the extent we have data on it, people spend between 6 to 10 seconds evaluating someone's CV or resume before they decide if they want to bring them to interview.
And in that, I've read 17 seconds, so it's even worse than I thought. In that 6 to 10 seconds, what do people look at? What filter are they applying?
Well, so this is where it gets awesome, because experimental economists and psychologists have been testing this actually for the last 70 years. It's depressing how long it's been going on. But what they'll do is they'll take 2 exactly similar candidates. So they'll say they went to the same universities, they studied the same things, they had the same prior work experience. And they'll send out these resumes to thousands of real employers who've, said that they want to fill a particular role. But what they'll do is before they send it out, they'll change one small tiny factor. So in some instances, what they'll do is they'll change it from Rodney to Aaron, or they'll change the ethnic association of your surname, or they'll change your home address, or they'll change the picture back in the day when it used to be, that you'd have pictures on your CVs. So now we've got evidence of people doing what they call correspondence studies. And what they do is they measure the rate at which Rodney or Aaron in equivalent circumstances with exactly the same background get called back for interview. And with that, they can then measure rates of discrimination. So we've been able to find, in US example, for example, there was a study done in, I think it was 2015, that showed that people with African-American surnames need to send out 50% more CVs to get the same rate of callback for interview, even when they're equally qualified for the job. Or that's another way of saying that is they need to have 5 more years of job experience to be seen as good as their white counterpart. Yeah. And, they've done equivalent studies here in the UK where we're based, but also in Australia. They've now done them in about 30 countries worldwide, and they've tested every type of discrimination you can imagine. So they've even, some of my favorite studies have taken a picture of a candidate and then used technology to create a more obese version of the exact same person, and showed that the more obese picture is less likely to be selected than the kind of slimmer picture. So we've basically been able to show in these 6 to 10 seconds that tiny details, but in some respects the most salient details. So if you look at a page of a CV, what sits at the top?
Usually name, title, and current organization.
Yeah. Or even random things like home address, or if you're in exactly and they've shown even in Sweden, for God's sake, they showed that if you came from a lower socioeconomic part of Stockholm, you were less likely to be selected than from a wealthier part of Stockholm. And this is the bastion of, social justice. So what we've been able to show is basically people are scanning, they're scanning super quickly. They're looking for bolded items. And along the way, they're also picking up unconsciously random details that have no relationship to job performance, like where I live or what ethnic association my surname has. And that is sort of forming part of their really quick snap, to use psychological language, that sort of system 1 thinking, type 1 thinking, the kind of automatic brain.
Which is interesting because, and this is exactly where I wanted to go next, obviously, a lot of that is unconscious. Maybe some of it's conscious, but I think a lot of folks would be surprised to see the rate at which they do that kind of discriminating. But there's also this whole thing about just how we form gut instincts about people, the whole thing about blink, the whole thing about, how do I feel? And that's really hard to manipulate. And so I'm curious, when you think about or when you counsel people who are in that interviewer position, how do you balance gut instinct about someone and also reducing bias? Can you even do both at the same time?
Aaron, such a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. As in, I guess we don't really know what forms gut. And so how much of that is just essentially affinity bias. Like,
Right,
we
right.
just sort of get along. Like, even this conversation, so easy. We like have a lot of things we have in common. We probably listen to the same kinds of podcasts, yours included, read similar books. Adam Grant's one of our advisors, and he's read and commented very, very positively about your book. We've probably got tons in common that gets picked up very, very quickly, and it just makes everything
Right.
easier, right?
We all go
So,
in group really fast. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, I'm having a better time on this podcast just because you're already thinking we've got a lot to talk about here.
Right.
And I'm probably performing better than I otherwise would if we didn't have some of that. So I guess what I mean is I don't know how much of gut is just affinity. It's probably not 100% that. There might be
Right.
something that we can't measure that is important. You could think about certain kinds of roles, like a sales role. Let's take it like a classic sales role. Some people just rub people up the wrong way, right?
Yeah.
And that might be hard to classify. We try and do that sort of thing. So just to pack apart what we do in and what we advise for hiring processes is that you focus on what the skills are really required for the job, and that you design work sample based assessments that you test everyone on in a fair way, and you evaluate them independently on different aspects. So if I was evaluating a new salesperson, I might put them through 6 to 7 to 8 scenarios in an interview that reflect different types of sales challenges. Maybe one is like, how do you just cold call somebody and tell them a bit about what you do? And then another part of it might be you're in a conversation with a potential client and they've got an issue with this. How do you deal with this particular objection while being
Right.
firm, but showing, emotional intelligence and so forth. And in doing that, we know we're making much more predictive decisions because it's much more related to what am I expecting this person to do in the job rather than do I just get along with them? But at the same time, we're also giving every candidate an equal shot at demonstrating different types of skills in different areas because people are really different. But there is going to be some latent part of this, which is hard to classify. It is a bit of a feeling we get about candidates. And actually, I was once lucky enough to chat to Danny Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow and is a Nobel laureate. It goes down in history for me as one of the most terrifying meetings I've ever been in. Being like, hey, we're using behavioral science to do some cool stuff around hiring. What do you think? And he had this really interesting perspective, which is when it comes to interviews, if you just tell people to have like a fully structured interview where there's no space for them to say, did I like the person?
Mm-hmm.
Like get to the end, because the reality is most interview processes is you remember the beginning, you remember the end, and you remember any like really wonderful or really awful part, but you forget,
Right.
57 other minutes that have just happened.
Sure.
And he says, actually what we should do behaviorally is give people a spot to just like write a really subjective statement. Did I like them or did I not? Would I want to work with them? Whatever the case may be, something that's deeply subjective. But have that as just one of the 7 or 8 things that you note about a candidate, and make sure that you are actually scoring them on these other work sample based aspects. And what it does behaviorally is it almost gives us a license to say, I had my say. I could say, I loved this person. They're amazing. And then almost I've like let myself go from that subjectivity and I can be more objective in the other aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if we are too draconian about saying like every single, minute of your interview needs to be quote unquote objective, we find other ways of kind
leakage.
of inserting. Yeah, you insert the subjectivity in other parts. So we've tried to use that in the way that we design Applied to make sure we don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, because if that's the case, we design something no one ever really wants to use, and actually people will let their gut drive the supposedly objective parts of a hiring process.
It's really interesting because we had this conversation literally yesterday at the Ready around our first wave of our first round of interview types, which is experiential in nature. And it's the kind of thing that we do with a client in partnership with someone else at the Ready. And I was having this really interesting discussion with our colleague Will about this very subject. And what we were saying is like, you go through this experience, and what we're finding with some of these people, because they are org design nerds like us and they've read Brave New Work and they sort of like know what the answers are in some ways that we're looking for, is that the content of the experience is quite good. Like what they are producing in the session is quite good. And to your point, there's all of the intangible things that happen in the interaction that currently there's no place for. And so Will and I were saying like, okay, so say for the first interview type, there's 3 scores right now based on 3 different sections. Do we just add a 4th question and score that is on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely are you to invite this person on your project given an opportunity? Because it just feels like there are these little things that creep up. And right now there's not a place in the process, because we're doing like our very first reps, to really talk about that more meta layer of the interaction.
Totally.
Should we do that?
I think so. I mean, I think if it's going to sit there as like a niggle, like if the reality is that the data will push you in the direction of something that just doesn't feel right, you should interrogate why it doesn't feel right. But yeah, we encourage people to say, like, have a section where you give a score out of 5 on, again, it could just be like, would we want to work with them? Do we think they'd be great here? But just make sure that that's only one data point in the, 8 or 9 that you're going to take into account, and don't let it dominate all the others. And, ideally, when you get big enough, you get enough data to be able to then pull a bunch of hiring processes together and be like, does this final random subjective score tell us anything that we wouldn't otherwise have found out? You can do some correlation analysis that tells you, is there something that's new in that data point, and what do we do with it? Or is it just something that we're doing to kind of almost put our minds at ease? Which is fine too.
Which is okay.
Then just don't include it. Like over time, you might not even want to include it in the model for deciding what you do, but certainly experimenting with it is better than, I know you guys are big believers, as we are, in you just have to experiment. If you don't experiment, you don't learn.
And it's been really funny because we've been along that note. I think one of our biggest challenges is being patient and actually running the experiment before we pull levers. Because, you do three candidates go through the first round and score really high. And we're like, maybe like it's too easy, or we're doing it wrong, or whatever. And we're trying to be really disciplined and saying like, okay, we're going to run this type 10 times and look at the data on 10 candidates and then see what kind of adjustment we're going to make. But even in our experimental mindset, like the harder part for us is sticking with it rather than immediately trying to iterate.
Yeah.
So I'm inclined to switch gears for a second and talk about the candidate experience, because we've only had a few candidates go through this process, but you've obviously seen a lot more. We're noticing that this is unusual for them because it's not the normal way of doing it. And so it can be a little bit triggering. People can freak out a little bit, or they're wondering. I think, Rodney, you told me once that, someone was asking you when they get a chance to kind of really sell themselves in the process, pitch? That kind of thing. Yeah. And so I'm very curious what your thoughts are on that. Like, what is the experience, and how do you make it palatable and ultimately positive for the candidates?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we first built Applied, kind of started from the standpoint of hiring processes at the moment are deeply asymmetric. If you think about most of the time when we apply for jobs, most people feel like they divulge, particularly these days, like they divulge every single detail about themselves, including the name of their first dog, in order to get a job. Most of the things that they divulge, they don't understand why. They don't really understand the connection between that and the relevance to the job itself. And most of them feel like they either don't know how they've performed, they don't even get a no. And even if they do get a no, they often get told, "I'm sorry, we can't give you any feedback." Even when you spend,
box.
Yeah. And it's demoralizing for most people. We've all been there. I certainly have been there. And in actual fact, 4 years ago or something, when we first started actually building Applied, we realized that because we were developing essentially a data model to collect unbiased data on whether a candidate had the skills required to do the job, we were like, well, we're sitting on all of this data to help organizations make great decisions. Why would we not just default to transparency back to the candidates themselves? And so we decided to implement a part of the platform which allows organizations and kind of encourages, through the default being that this is what will happen unless you tell us otherwise, that the candidate will get unbiased feedback on how they performed against different skill sets relative to other candidates who applied, so that they can learn, oh, great, actually it was these particular 3 areas I was great at, but it was actually something around the way that I dealt with that tricky client that probably fell short, and that helps me to understand how I can learn if I wanted to apply again to a job at the ready. And we did that, knowing that actually was because part of the kind of weird thing about running hiring platforms is that you realize to your horror that you're actually running a rejection platform. So like, just to give you an example, we've just had over 150,000 candidates come through our platform all over the world. About 3,500 to 4,000 of them have gotten a job. And that gives you a sense of how many thousands of people have interacted with our platform but didn't get the outcome that they were initially hoping for. And so we felt like this was a huge opportunity for us to give back to those people, sort of a sense of reciprocity, like you applied and put some effort into that. And here's us saying thank you together with the organization for that time and effort you did. Of course, there's a ton of evidence to suggest it's like a good thing for organizations to do anyway. Like there's all this sort of crazy research now about the rate at which people take to social media when they have a poor experience and how that impacts on brand and so forth. Personally, I think it's just the right thing to do, but it happens to also be like a good business move. But anyway, as a result of all of that, we also collect feedback from candidates at various stages. So as you know, we collect their feedback after they've applied. And also, even if they don't get selected, we then ask them to rate the platform. And our median scores, even from those who've been unsuccessful, are over 8 out of 10, or our, like, you know, to use the net promoter score thing, we're in the kind of 20 to 30 range, which is pretty good, especially considering that they haven't gotten a job.
They just didn't get a job.
Exactly. Yeah. And the net promoter score for people actually applying to jobs is in the 50 to 70 range, which is pretty phenomenal. And the things that we see, because you're right, it's totally unusual. Most candidates are used to like, here is my CV, I will potentially hear from you in 3 weeks' time.
Right.
Whereas we're saying, here are a bunch of challenges you might face in this role. What would you do in these types of scenarios? And we're going to use that as a way of assessing your application. And what you really get from people is like, wow, this feels really different. I'm used to selling myself, as you've heard, through a CV, but now I'm being asked to demonstrate whether I can do the job. And what we've seen is, particularly for underrepresented groups, so for people of color, we've got a much higher rating again on that experience. And a lot of people come to us saying, I wouldn't have had the confidence to apply if it was a CV process, because I know that they're biased and I didn't think I would have any chance of surviving that process. But now I've been given a chance to show myself and what I can do without the baggage of any of those kinds of biases. So I think you're right that it is very different for candidates, but we've been quite positively surprised at the kind of candidate response that we get to that.
Nice.
So along those lines, that's really great to hear. For people who maybe are out there and are wanting to make some moves in this direction, but are not using the applied system, what would you say is the right level of detail to provide candidates in terms of feedback? Like, what are some tips that you have? Because many of us have touched that hot stove where we like gave someone a lot of information because we were trying to do the right thing, and then got into a very spirited and lengthy debate that ultimately we had to shut down about whether that was valid feedback. So for those who are doing this, like, you know, hacking it at home, what are some guiding principles that you would give them in terms of what you actually tell people about how they did?
So, if you're hacking this at home, the things I would probably say are, one, before you do the hiring process, at least do the exercise of figuring out what it is that matters for that role. Because anyway, that's just going to help you select the best person, but it'll also mean, and you've got yourself a framework to then go back to any candidate that didn't succeed. And you can say, well, we were most interested in these 4 or 5 skill sets, and we perceived that we didn't get evidence of these 2 particular skill sets being strong enough for you relative to the other candidates. So one, you've already got a framework that, one, helps you make a great decision, but 2, is also useful for kind of structuring feedback. The second thing I would say is, in our experience, candidates tend to react best when they at least understand how a decision got taken. It's kind of like a bit of a procedural fairness thing. People, particularly skeptical people, will be likely to try and shine a light or draw a wedge on anything that seems unexplained. And so often what we would encourage people to do, and it's easier if people are using a platform like ours, because organizations can just point them to, this is how the platform works. But if that's not the case for you, you can say, well, just to give you an idea of what our process looked like, we first evaluated people on the basis of this, then on this, then on this. And on the basis of these skill sets, these are the areas that you were weaker on. That doesn't mean we don't think you probably don't have that. We just didn't see the evidence of it. And there can be kind of like a subtle difference between telling people that they don't have a skill versus telling them that we didn't see evidence in this particular process of that. And we'd love to hear from you again. I
like that.
And it sounds semantic, but it's actually quite important, because candidates understandably, we're all human. None of us likes not getting a job. None of us likes being told we're not quite right. But most of us will appreciate someone just taking the time to walk us through it. Is what's interesting to me is for you all in the US, we experience you to be the most litigiously fearful.
We sure are.
We work in
guilty as charged.
Well, we work in many countries all over the world, and it is a totally different context in the US. And I think one of the things that makes all of this so much worse is that the very groups that those laws are designed to help end up hurting them the most, because people are so sensitive to what they will share with candidates that they share nothing at all, which means no one benefits. And so we're sort of the view, we can make it easy through our platform, because none of the candidate details were available to the assessors when they're assessing them in the SIFT stage. You can be very confident in saying, there couldn't have been a version of this where I selected you or didn't on the basis of your name or your background or any of those things, because that's exactly what I don't see. So there's the comfort, we aim to actually have that as being a kind of comfort to your kind of nervous legal departments, who inevitably come back to you being like, oh God, what are you possibly doing? Whereas we're just structured in a way that you don't even have to worry about that. But for those hacking it, I reckon ahead of time designing, what are the kind of key things, the key stages of your process, key skills you're testing for, use that as a framework for giving it, and explain the process to candidates. And then explain, not that you're terrible at all of these things, just that we didn't see it this time.
So that brings me to a varsity question, which is, given that we can say to the candidate, oh, we couldn't see your name, we couldn't see your face, we couldn't see your background. What we can see is what you wrote. And what we're finding is that there's even little peaks of bias hiding in just the way people write, the kinds of words they use, the tone they use, the way that we can sort of sense into their identity, or some of the things they accidentally divulge about their identity by the way they write. It does feel like we're kind of fractally zooming in on smaller and smaller pieces of bias. So I'm curious, have you heard other people that use the platform start to talk about that and zero into that? And what is your recommendation? Should we worry about that? Should we dig into that? Should we not worry about that? How do you think about it?
It's such a good question. We have people say to us someone once used their name, and it's it's okay. You're absolutely right. Because we've taken most of that stuff away from you, you just become incredibly conscious of any tiny detail that you might get. The thing I would say is three things. One is, if the way that people write is not super important to the job itself, feel free to play around with, well, you could answer this in bullet points. I don't need prose. A lot of people think, well, people who write better in prose, they clearly do better in our platform. Well, that might be true if that's actually something that you need, a skill that you need them to have, but you don't need to receive information entirely in that format. So that's one thing that we sometimes recommend. But the other stuff I would say is, actually, you'd be surprised how differently, or at least I'm curious whether you all have looked at your degrees of disagreement over candidate scores. And one of the things we've discovered is that people like people who write very differently. And that's why we actually encourage multiple people to score, and we'll average out all of your scores to account for the fact that some people love someone who's super verbose and uses lots of multisyllabic words, and other people like very plain spoken. And so some of that gets rounded out just by having different perspectives, which again is this beauty of the wisdom of the crowd, or the kind of power of diversity. The third thing I would say, though, is I think you're right to be aware of it. I'm glad that we're helping to be a platform that helps you to see that, but don't over attend to it, because one of the other things we have in the platform is that we assess every single question that's used. And once we get to statistical significance, we can start to test for other forms of latent bias. So one of the things we can do is here is a question which on the face of it wouldn't have had any gender bias, let's say. But it turns out that the way that people respond to that question does mean that women or men tend to be performing, or non-binary people tend to be performing significantly better or worse than their counterparts. And once we have enough data, we can just say there is something, we can't necessarily identify what it is about this question, that's just not quite working.
Something's off.
Exactly. Yeah. And we take it out of the library and we flag it. So over time, basically, the system is always self-learning around even those small latent biases.
Cool.
The one other thing I wanted to hit, Kate, is around sort of the bar. So we've had a lot of conversations since we started this process and been designing our app and also been designing interviews, where many of us have said, like, I don't know if I would make it through this process if I were applying now. Is that okay? What do you think about that?
I fear that. I actually had to go through, applied to get one of my jobs because I had to apply for a new visa, which required me to go through a formal hiring process all over again. I tell you what, it was a bit scary. Some really excellent people. This was a few years ago as CEO. It's pretty terrifying thinking you might not get your own job. Though I thought it would make for an amazing blog post about how successful Applied was, that the CEO didn't even get the job when she applied through her own platform. I think I don't think you need to be that worried about that. You know the things that make your team successful. And also there's a difference between what you two bring to your team and what it is that you're looking to add to your team, right? So you're not hiring for your own roles. You're hiring for people to contribute new things that the two of you and your colleagues don't already have, that are mission aligned, but adding some skills and culture additions that you may or may not have. So I'd be surprised if you actually put your own roles out that you wouldn't be successful, but it does focus the mind on, what are the skills and attributes we really need people in this particular role to have, and making sure that we sort of stay close to those. And then, making sure we do the evaluation of, like, do we think that all of the aspects of the way that our people processes work kind of hold true to that? That's something that we're a hiring platform principally, but as you might imagine, we do a lot of navel gazing at Applied. We apply a lot of the research around people, a lot of what you pay attention to and work with your clients on. We also do around our own progression frameworks and how we think about salary benchmarking and how we think about transparency and all of those things. So I think it's probably healthy that we apply that same level of rigor to all aspects of our organization where we can.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, where we've netted out on that question as we've discussed it, because early on we were like, we should all put ourselves through it, see how we do. And then where we landed in the discussion is actually, for most of us, when we were applying and talking to the Ready about joining, there was no book. There were not things written down the way that there are now. There was no podcast. Like, the candidates now should be smarter. They should be more able to talk about this stuff because there's a lot more written about our space and about our
the
company.
Scaffolding is better.
And the world of the future of work and of org design practitioners is very different than it was 5 years ago. And so we're kind of part of the reason that we wouldn't get it is because we were dumb then and now we're much smarter. And now we expect everybody else to be smarter too because we made all the stuff to help them get smart. So that's how we've rationalized our own realization that we probably wouldn't get hired.
I might steal that from you.
Yeah, please do.
Well, I think it's totally right. And I'm always skeptical of quoting anything that's ever been attributed to Mark Zuckerberg, but I believe he was one of the people who said, you should always aim to hire people that are better than you. And whether that was him or somebody else. I mean, it is sort of intuitive. We should all want to be, we say that in the team, we should make sure every person that comes in is doing something that we otherwise couldn't do well, like that. Mm-hmm. And that is certainly what we would do. But you're right. You've created the environment for people to sound much smarter about your own topics just by reading your book. So you should have a higher bar because you actually had to create all of the content of that particular book. You had to do all of the heavy lifting intellectually behind all of that. Other people can now understand it and parrot it back to you, but you're probably looking for people to come up with new ideas rather than just parrot back your own.
Absolutely.
So as a final gauntlet for us, I think the question is, somebody's listening, maybe they don't have, they're not yet using the Applied platform, but they want to improve their hiring process. They want to get some bias out of it. They want to do it better. What would be, 2 or 3 things that you'd recommend they just do straight away that would help, no matter where they are or what category they're in?
So I guess depending on the size of organization, but if they're a smaller organization, I'm guessing that a fair bit of their hiring is just purely networks. And we've all fallen prey to that in the past. But I would say that if you actually care about building a diverse and inclusive team, you have to be really wary of the fact that most of us, myself included, have much narrower networks than there is actually out there. So one thing I would just say, I know it sounds really obvious, but actually advertise your jobs because you never know who out there, it sounds really silly, but you never know who out there would be this is the kind of job I've always been looking for. So one is actually proactively advertise them. If you've got even the slightest bit of capacity to do so, think about trying to target underrepresented groups and networks that you don't already have access to, because all of the evidence points in the direction of diverse teams tend to perform better. They tend to be more innovative, come up with more sort of lasting solutions. They see and interpret data in more detail and more depth, and remember more facts of a case, even in a jury selection scenario. So you will probably design a better performing organization just by targeting diversity alone. And the other stuff I would say is kind of back to what I said earlier is, before you hire, think about what it is you actually want that person to do in practical terms. Like, what is a week in the life of that job? Because we all otherwise fall prey to this thing of being like, oh yes, I need a operations manager, and I'll just sort of figure out what I mean by that somewhere in the hiring process. And that is usually when it becomes a case of, I met this person, they seemed really competent, I'm sure they'd pick it up. But actually what you haven't done is gone like, well, actually, here's what the kind of 5 main sorts of areas of responsibility I want them to have, and therefore the kinds of skills they'll need to have. And you need to make sure you actually test for those specific things and be willing to surprise yourself. There are occasionally times. So our one of our advisors who's been with us for like 5 years is a professor at Harvard called Iris Bonet. And she often uses the example of she knew she had to sort of eat her own dog food, to use that phrase, and use work sample assessments to hire for her new executive assistant. And the person who came out on top, this kind of comes back to our original point, Rodney, but like the person who came out on top was not the person she had the greatest rapport with, but they just nailed it. And she was like, well, if I actually believe all this stuff about what is predictive of job performance and not spending too much time worrying about whether or not I would sit and have a glass of Pinot Grigio with them on Thursday evening or whatever the case may be, I should hire them. And she did. And this EA has been with her for like 4 years and is incredibly successful. But she had to sort of say to herself, I'm willing to be surprised by this process. And just doing that alone kind of provides like the mental space to then take a bit more of what we might think of as a quote unquote risk, which is actually more evidence-based.
That's awesome. With that in mind, I'm going to draw us to a close so we can all get back to important interviews. Kate,
have fun.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been so much fun.
Rodney, always a pleasure. We'll let you know.
The worst.
And a quick tip of the hat to Taylor Marvin for making us sound good. Brave New Work is produced by The Ready, where we help organizations around the world change the way they work. You can get in touch with us by emailing podcast@theready.com. And if you like what you're hearing, a review would mean an awful lot to us. Or even better, forward this show to someone who needs it. And as for you, thanks for listening. Now go change something.